The afternoon sun, warm and benevolent, spilled across the freshly mown lawn of Michael Thompson's backyard. It caught the edges of the newly installed trim on his shed, making the crisp white paint gleam against the deep forest green of the walls. The shed wasn't large, barely 100 square feet, but it was perfect. It was his fortress of solitude, his future home office, the tangible result of 3 weekends of painstaking work. He had leveled the foundation, framed the walls, and shingled the roof himself. Each nail a small victory against the uncertainty that had shadowed his family since the corporate restructuring had eliminated his position 2 months ago. From inside, the scent of fresh lumber and possibility was intoxicating. He breathed it in, a deep, satisfying draft of self-reliance. He was admiring the finality of the door handle, a handsome piece of brushed nickel, when a polite cough drifted from the edge of his property. Michael turned. Standing on the manicured grass of the community walking path, the common area, was Karen Wells, president of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. Beside her, a man in a polo shirt and work boots was methodically planting a tripod in the ground, a surveyor's transit mounted on top. Karen was a portrait of suburban precision. Her blonde hair was arranged in a sensible but immaculate bob, her navy blue blazer sharp enough to cut glass, and her smile was a carefully calibrated instrument of pleasant authority. "Michael." "Good afternoon," she said, her voice carrying easily in the quiet air. It was a voice that never needed to be raised. Its power came from the assumption that it would always be heeded. "Karen," Michael replied, stepping off the small porch of his shed. "Everything all right?" "Just doing a routine review of the common area boundaries," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the surveyor. "We have to ensure all encroachments are documented for the association's insurance renewal." The surveyor, for his part, remained entirely focused on his equipment, peering through the eyepiece and making minute adjustments, a silent, official-looking prop in Karen's procedural theater. Karen took a half-step closer, her gaze drifting from Michael to the shed, then back again. Her smile didn't falter, but its warmth receded. "While we're here, I did notice your new accessory structure." The term was so sterile, so deliberately devoid of the pride Michael felt. "It's very well built." "Thanks," Michael said, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "Just finished it. It's my new office." "I see," Karen said. She clasped her hands in front of her. "The board will, of course, have to review the matter, but I feel it's my duty to inform you that this structure is in potential violation of the view corridor easement as defined in the CC&Rs. The phrase hung in the air, dense with bureaucratic weight. "The what?" Michael asked. "The view corridor easement," she repeated, her tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "It's to protect the natural sightlines from the common areas. Article 8 in the covenants. I'm sure you remember it from your closing documents." She glanced at the surveyor, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod without looking up. The message was clear. This wasn't a casual chat. It was the opening move in a formal process. "I got an ACC permit for a shed," Michael said, his hand instinctively patting the pocket where he'd kept the folded approval form. "Yes, for a shed," Karen acknowledged. "But the placement, you see, is the issue. The easement is very specific." She gave him another one of her bright, unreadable smiles. "Don't worry just yet. The board will discuss it at our next working session. We'll be in touch." And with that, she turned and walked away, her sensible heels leaving faint impressions in the soft grass of the common area. The surveyor packed up his tripod with quiet efficiency and followed her. The confrontation had been entirely civil. No voices were raised, No harsh words exchanged. It was quiet, polite, and the most unnerving conversation Michael had had in years. He looked at his shed, the symbol of his fight for a new beginning, and, for the first time, saw it not as a solution, but as a target. "She what?" Sarah asked, her fork hovering over her plate of spaghetti. She had listened to Michael's account of the afternoon's encounter with a deepening frown. Sarah was the pragmatist in their marriage, a high school science teacher who viewed the world as a series of problems to be analyzed and solved. Her calm, logical approach was the perfect counterbalance to Michael's more emotional responses. "She called it an accessory structure," Michael said, pushing a meatball around his plate. "And she had a surveyor with her." Sarah, a surveyor, like they were preparing for a lawsuit. "Okay, let's not jump to lawsuits yet," Sarah said, setting her fork down. "What exactly is a view corridor easement?" "I have no idea. Something about protecting sightlines from the walking path?" He sighed, the frustration of the day returning. "She said it's in the CC&Rs. That binder they gave us at closing that's thick enough to stop a bullet." The shed was more than just a project to keep Michael busy. After his layoff from a mid-level marketing position he'd held for 12 years, a cloud of quiet panic had settled over their home. He was a good provider, a man who had always prided himself on his stability. The sudden loss of that identity had shaken him. He'd spent the first few weeks in a daze, sending out resumes into the digital void and receiving only automated rejections in return. The idea for the shed had been Sarah's. "You've always wanted to try freelancing," she'd said one evening. "You're a great writer. Michael, you could build a business, but you need a dedicated space, away from the house, away from the laundry and the television." He had seized the idea. Building the shed became his new job. It was a project with a clear beginning, a challenging middle, and a satisfying end. It gave him purpose again. He'd spent hours researching Oakhaven Estate's notoriously complex architectural guidelines, filling out the ACC application with painstaking detail, even including a hand-drawn diagram showing its placement in the far corner of their quarter-acre lot. The approval had come back 3 weeks later, a single stamped sheet of paper that felt like a passport to his new life. The shed wasn't just wood and nails. It was his office, his headquarters, the physical foundation for his plan to support his family on his own terms. Karen Wells, however, was a known variable in the Oakhaven equation. She had been board president for 5 years, running the HOA with an iron will and an encyclopedic knowledge of the governing documents. Her enforcement was legendary for its meticulousness and its selectivity. The Millers, 2 doors down, had received a violation notice for having a garden hose that was not of an earth-tone shade. Yet the former board treasurer's garish pink flamingos, a clear violation of the prohibition on lawn ornaments, had remained untouched for years. Karen's rule was absolute. Her interpretations of the CC&Rs final. She was, as Sarah often put it, a procedural tyrant. "She's targeting you." "Michael," Sarah said, her voice firm. "She does this. She finds someone who won't make a fuss and makes an example of them to remind everyone who's in charge." "But I followed the rules. He insisted. I got the permit." "Her rules are fluid," Sarah countered. "So, what's our next move? We don't just wait for her to be in touch." Michael stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out into the deepening twilight at the dark silhouette of his shed. "I'm going to find that binder," he said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "And I'm going to read every single word of Article 8. A week passed in a state of tense silence. Michael half expected a formal notice to appear in their mailbox each day, but nothing came. Life went on. He landed a small freelance gig, writing web copy for a local dentist, and the first payment was enough to cover their groceries for 2 weeks. It was a small, but significant victory. He spent his days working at the kitchen table, glancing out the window at the empty waiting shed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the mail carrier didn't just drop the mail in the slot. He rang the doorbell, holding a clipboard and a pale green envelope. Certified mail for Michael Thompson, he announced. Michael's heart gave a dull thud against his ribs. He signed the electronic pad, the plastic stylus slick in his sweating palm. He closed the door and stood in the foyer for a long moment, staring at the envelope. It felt heavier than it should. The return address was for the HOA's management company, a sterile P.O. box in a neighboring city. He opened it with a letter opener, the slice of the blade unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Inside was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, printed with the Oakhaven Estates HOA letterhead. Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association Formal Notice of Violation. Date October 12, 2023. Property address 124 Chestnut Lane. Owner of record Michael and Sarah Thompson. Via USPS certified mail. Tracking Yard 9405 5036 9930 0482 1234 56. Dear Mr. Thompson, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions (CC&Rs) for Oakhaven Estates. A recent inspection conducted on October 5, 2023, identified a violation on your property. Violation: unapproved placement of an accessory structure within a designated view corridor easement. Relevant governing document provision, CC&R, Figure 8.4.2, which states, no structure, fence, or landscaping element exceeding 4 feet in height shall be erected or maintained within the 10-foot view corridor easement that runs contiguous to all common area boundaries on properties located east of the Oakhaven Drainage Creek, so as to preserve the natural and unobstructed sightlines for the enjoyment of all residents. Corrective action required. The accessory structure shed must be removed from the easement area. Deadline for compliance. You have 14 days from the date of this notice until October 26, 2023, to bring the property into compliance. Consequences of non-compliance. Failure to comply by the specified deadline will result in the levying of a fine of $100 plus an additional fine of $25 per day until the violation is cured. Pursuant to the association's bylaws, you have the right to request a hearing before the Board of Directors to contest this violation. A request for a hearing must be submitted in writing to the management company no later than the compliance deadline. Sincerely, the Oakhaven Estates Board of Directors, CAO Sterling Management Solutions. Michael read the letter 3 times. His eyes kept snagging on one phrase: properties located east of the Oakhaven Drainage Creek. He walked to the window and looked out. Their house was on the west side of the creek. The creek, little more than a gully that bisected the neighborhood, was 100 yards past the common area behind his house. A slow, burning anger began to replace his anxiety. This wasn't just selective enforcement. This was wrong. The rule, as written, didn't even apply to him. He pulled out the massive 3-ring binder of HOA documents and flipped to Article 8, his finger tracing the text until he found it. There it was. Figure 8.4.2 verbatim. When Sarah came home, she found him at the kitchen table with the violation notice, the CC&Rs, and a neighborhood map spread out before him like a general planning a campaign. They cited a rule that doesn't apply to us, he said, his voice tight with a mixture of outrage and relief. We're on the west side of the creek. The rule is for the east side. Sarah read the notice, then the CC&R clause. A slow smile spread across her face. "Well, this should be a short conversation. Then, you just email them, point out their mistake, and that's the end of it." "That's the plan," Michael said, already composing the email in his head. It would be polite, factual, and irrefutable. He would attach a scan of the relevant page and a map highlighting their property's location. This was a simple clerical error, a mistake made by an overzealous board president. It had to be. He sent the email that evening, feeling a sense of righteous confidence. He had the facts, the documents, the truth. In the world of HOA disputes, that had to be enough. The reply from Sterling Management Solutions arrived 2 days later. It was not the apology and retraction Michael had expected. "Dear Mr. Thompson, thank you for your correspondence. The Board of Directors has reviewed your email and maintains its position regarding the violation. While we acknowledge the specific phrasing in FIRE 8.4.2, Board Resolution 2022-04 clarifies the intent of the view corridor easement to apply to all properties contiguous to common areas, regardless of the creek's location, to ensure uniform aesthetic standards. The formal notice of violation stands. Please be reminded of the compliance deadline of October 26, 2023. A board resolution. Michael's blood ran cold. They had created a new rule, or clarified an old one, without notifying the homeowners. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated move. "This is insane," he said to Sarah, reading the email aloud. "They can just invent new rules in secret." "There has to be a process for that," Sarah said, her brow furrowed. "They can't just have a private meeting and decide the CC&Rs mean whatever they want them to mean. That's not how contracts work." His confidence shaken. Michael knew an email exchange was no longer sufficient. He needed to speak to them, to reason with them in person. The HOA calendar listed an Architectural Control Committee meeting for the following Tuesday. It was his only chance for an informal resolution before the deadline. The ACC meeting was held in a small, windowless room at the management company's office. The air was stale with the smell of old coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Michael was the only homeowner present. He sat on a flimsy folding chair opposite a long table, where 3 committee members sat like judges. Karen was not on the committee, but she was present, seated slightly behind the members, observing. Her presence dominated the room. The committee chair, a man named George, peered at Michael over his reading glasses. "Mr. Thompson, we understand you wish to discuss the violation notice regarding your shed." "Yes," Michael began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. According to the plain text of the CC&Rs, the easement rule doesn't apply to my lot. I'm on the west side of the creek." George glanced at a folder in front of him. "Yes, we have your email. And, as the management company's response indicated, Board Resolution 2022-04 clarified the board's interpretation of that clause. But a resolution can't override the CC&Rs. Can it?" Michael pressed. "That's the core legal document. Changing it would require a vote of the homeowners, wouldn't it?" He was channeling what he'd learned from a frantic night of Googling HOA law. One of the other committee members, a woman with severely styled hair, sighed audibly. "We are not here to debate legal interpretations. Mr. Thompson, the board has established a clear and consistent policy. The purpose of this committee is to review applications and enforce the architectural guidelines as directed by the board." "But the policy isn't consistent," Michael argued, his frustration rising. The rule was clearly written to apply only to one section of the neighborhood. It was then that Karen leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting. "George, if I may, Mr. Thompson, the board's legal counsel has affirmed our authority to pass resolutions that interpret and clarify ambiguities in the governing documents. This is a matter of procedural correctness. She turned her gaze to Michael, her eyes devoid of any sympathy. The ACC is not the proper venue for this discussion. If you wish to formally contest the violation, you must request a hearing with the board of directors, as outlined in your notice. We must follow due process. The phrase was a brick wall. They were using the process to shut down the conversation. They refused to discuss the substance of his argument, hiding behind a shield of procedure. George nodded, relieved to have a script to follow. Karen is correct. We cannot discuss the specifics of your case outside of a formal hearing. Do you have any other new applications to discuss? He looked at Michael expectantly. Michael was speechless. He had come for a reasonable discussion and had been met with a bureaucratic wall. They wouldn't even acknowledge his point. He felt small and powerless. A citizen caught in the gears of a machine he didn't understand. He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't. He walked out of the sterile office and into the fading afternoon light, feeling utterly defeated. The informal path was closed. His only option now was to fight them on their own turf. In a formal hearing, he was sure they had already decided to rule against him. The fight was no longer about a simple mistake. It was about an abuse of power. And Michael, armed with nothing but the plain text of a rule they had secretly rewritten, had to find a way to win. The first step, Michael realized, was to arm himself with more than just a single clause from the CC&Rs. He had to understand the battlefield. The next morning, he drove to the county recorder's office, a stoic granite building downtown. The records room was a quiet, dusty sanctuary of public information, filled with the scent of old paper and the soft rustle of pages being turned. He requested the official plat map for the Oakhaven Estates subdivision and the easement deeds for his specific lot. A clerk returned with a long, rolled-up tube. Michael carefully unrolled the map across a large wooden table. It was a beautiful, intricate document, a spiderweb of property lines, utility easements, and lot numbers, all hand-drawn with an architect's precision. He found his lot, number 78 on Chestnut Lane, and there, running along the back of his property, was a faint dotted line. The legend in the corner identified it 10PUE, a public utility easement. There was no mention of a view corridor easement anywhere on the map for his section of the development. However, when he traced the Oakhaven Drainage Creek eastward, he saw it. On the other side of the creek, a different dotted line appeared along the rear of those properties, clearly labeled 10D VCE, View Corridor Easement. The plat map, the official legal record of the subdivision filed with the county, directly contradicted the board's interpretation. His heart beat a little faster. This was concrete. This was evidence. He spent the next hour with his property's deed, a dense document filled with legal jargon. Buried in the text was a section listing all encumbrances and easements. It listed the utility easement. It made no mention of a view corridor. His next call was to David Chen, a neighbor from the next street over. David was a retired civil engineer who had spent 40 years working for the county, much of that time reviewing subdivision plans just like Oakhaven's. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his late 60s who spent most of his time in his garage workshop. David agreed to look at the documents. That afternoon, he sat at Michael's kitchen table, a magnifying glass in hand, poring over the copies Michael had made. "Well, I'll be." David grunted after a long silence. He tapped a thick finger on the plat map. "It's as plain as day. The VCE is explicitly delineated and only applies to the lots east of the creek. Your lot isn't encumbered by it. The filed plat map is the controlling legal document. An HOA can't just invent an easement with a resolution. That's what I thought, Michael said, feeling a surge of validation. But they're claiming their lawyer says they can, David said, stroking his chin. That's bold. Or stupid. Or both. He looked at Michael. You need more. You need to know why they're doing this. This smells funny. You should request all the board meeting minutes for the past 2 years, especially for the meeting where they passed this Resolution 2022-04. Following David's advice, Michael submitted a formal records request to the management company, citing the state's Planned Community Act, which guaranteed homeowners access to association records. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived. Inside were 2 years' worth of meeting minutes. He and Sarah spread them across the dining room table. Most of it was mundane approvals for fence repairs, discussions about pool maintenance, budget reviews. But as he got closer to the date of the supposed resolution, he noticed something odd. The minutes for the executive sessions, the private meetings of the board were heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs were blacked out with thick, dark marker. He found the minutes for the April 2022 meeting. Under New Business, there was a single-line motion to approve Resolution 2022-04 regarding clarification of easement standards. Motion passes 5-0. There was no text of the resolution, no record of the discussion. It was a ghost. And then he saw it. The meeting right before that. In March 2022, there was a section titled Executive Session Vendor Contract Review. Half a page was completely blacked out. The only legible text was the motion at the end motion to approve a 3-year renewal of the master landscaping contract with Greenscape Solutions, LLC. Motion passes 5-0. Greenscape Solutions, Sarah said, typing the name into her laptop. They're the company that does all the landscaping and maintenance in the common areas. They also do tree removal, fence repairs, basically any outdoor work. So, what was so sensitive about their contract renewal that it had to be blacked out? Michael wondered aloud. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but the key element was still missing. Why would the board reinterpret an easement rule that affected only a handful of homes and then redact the minutes? It felt like more than just a power trip. There was something they were actively hiding. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Eleanor Vance, one of the original homeowners in Oak Haven and a long-serving, if quiet, member of the HOA board, called Michael on a Thursday evening. Her voice was frail but firm. Michael, this is Eleanor Vance, from the board. I need to speak with you. Can you come over? Michael found her sitting in an immaculate living room filled with antiques and the scent of lemon polish. Eleanor was in her 80s, a woman who carried the history of the neighborhood with her. She had voted in favor of the resolution and the contract renewal, and her conscience was clearly weighing on her. I don't agree with what Karen is doing to you, she began, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. She has become overzealous. Eleanor explained that the board had grown increasingly reliant on Karen's interpretations of the rules and the advice of the HOA's lawyer. We were told the resolution was a simple clarification to ensure uniformity, a housekeeping matter. But it wasn't. Was it? Michael said gently. It fundamentally changed the rules for half the neighborhood. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with regret. Karen manages all the vendor relationships. She presented the Greenscape contract renewal as a formality. We were told the redactions in the minutes were to protect proprietary pricing information. She paused, taking a deep breath. But after your request for the records, I became concerned. I looked at my own copies of the meeting packets. The ones we received before the minutes were officially redacted and filed. From a folder on her side table, she pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the minutes from the March 2022 executive session. It was unredacted. Michael took the page, his eyes scanning the text that had been hidden behind a black marker. His breath caught in his throat. The redacted section was an addendum to the Greenscape contract. It established a new fee schedule. In addition to their monthly maintenance fee, Greenscape would now be paid a premium, on a per-job basis, for remediation of homeowner compliance violations, including the removal of non-compliant structures, fences, and landscaping. But it was the last sentence of the addendum that made everything click into place. The board agrees to proactively identify and pursue enforcement of covenant violations that may require Greenscape's remediation services, creating new revenue opportunities. It wasn't about views. It wasn't about uniformity. It was a scheme to generate business for the HOA's landscaping contractor. The board had secretly voted to reinterpret a rule to create violations they could then pay a contractor to fix. Why, Michael asked, looking up at Eleanor. Why would they do this? I don't know the whole story, Eleanor confessed. But I do know one thing. The owner of Greenscape Solutions is Karen's brother-in-law. The final piece slotted into place with a sickening thud. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was calculated, self-serving corruption. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was manufacturing violations to enrich her own family. Michael looked at the unredacted minutes in his hand. He now had the full story. He had the plat map, the deed, and now, the motive. He had the truth. But knowing the truth and being able to use it were two very different things. He had to present this perfectly. He formally requested his hearing. The date was set for 2 weeks later, at the monthly board meeting. Just as Michael was beginning to feel he had the upper hand, a new letter arrived. This one was from a law firm, Counsel for Oakhaven Estates, HOA. The language was dense, intimidating, and stripped of all pretense of neighborly courtesy. Re-notice of intent to lien. Dear Mr. Thompson, this firm represents the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association. Please be advised that your property remains in violation of CC&R February 8.4.2. The deadline for compliance has passed. Fines have now begun to accrue at a rate of $25 per day. As of this date, your delinquent account balance is $175. Be advised that should the violation not be cured, and all outstanding fines and fees not be paid in full within 30 days, the association will exercise its right under the CC&Rs and state law to place a lien on your property at 124 Chestnut Lane. The association will pursue all available legal remedies to collect this debt, including, but not limited to, foreclosure of the lien. Your hearing is scheduled for November 9th. Please govern yourself accordingly. The threat of a lien and the mention of foreclosure was a massive escalation. This was no longer about a daily fine. This was a direct threat to their home, their largest financial asset. The pressure was immense. The ticking clock wasn't just for the hearing. It was for the mounting debt and the legal machinery Karen had now fully activated against them. That night, Sarah was quiet, her usual pragmatism strained. A lien. Michael can. They really do that? Legally, yes, he said, the lawyer's letter feeling like a lead weight in his hand. If the board rules against me at the hearing, the fines are official. If we don't pay, they can put a lien on the house. He decided to visit Eleanor again, to thank her for the minutes, and to update her on the lawyer's letter. She listened patiently, her expression growing more troubled. Michael, you have the facts on your side. she said when he had finished. The plat map is undeniable. The unredacted minutes show the board's actions were improper. That is enough to win your case and have the violation overturned. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But this other business, the contract, her brother-in-law, that is an accusation of corruption. It's an attack on Karen's character, not just her decision. But it's the truth, Michael insisted. It's the reason for all of this. I know, Eleanor said softly. But think about what will happen if you make that accusation in a public meeting. It will become a scandal. It will tear this community apart. There will be factions, accusations, lawsuits. It will poison this neighborhood for years. You can burn the whole forest down to get one tree. Or you can prove your case so cleanly that no one gets hurt but the person who broke the rules. Her words hit him hard. He had been so focused on exposing the entire rotten scheme that he hadn't considered the collateral damage. Did he want to win a battle or start a war? Winning his case was about saving his shed and his family's financial future. Exposing Karen's corruption was about justice. But at what cost to the community he lived in? He left Eleanor's house with a heavy heart. He had the evidence to destroy Karen Wells completely. But his moral compass, this kind, elderly woman who loved her community, was telling him to show restraint. He had 1 week until the hearing to decide what kind of victory he was fighting for. The community clubhouse was a sterile, multi-purpose room with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and a faint, lingering scent of disinfectant. On the second Thursday of every month, it transformed into the seat of power for Oak Haven Estates. A long table was set up at the front for the 5 board members. A single podium stood before it for homeowners. To the right of the podium, on an easel, was a large digital clock, its red numerals already counting down the strict 3-minute speaking limit allocated to each resident on the agenda. Michael sat in the third row of folding chairs, a slim portfolio on his lap. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting reassuringly on his arm. About 30 other homeowners were scattered throughout the room. At the head of the table sat Karen Wells, looking poised and implacable. The other 4 board members, including Eleanor, flanked her. A representative from Sterling Management sat at the end of the table, taking minutes. The meeting began with procedural formalities, the approval of last month's minutes, the treasurer's report. Then, Karen's voice cut through the drone. Next on the agenda is the violation hearing for Lot 78-124, Chestnut Lane. Mr. Thompson, you have 3 minutes. The clock was reset 3:00. Michael walked to the podium, his pulse a steady, dull thud in his temples. He placed his portfolio on the lectern and looked directly at the board. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and calm. "My name is Michael Thompson. I'm here to appeal the violation notice regarding my shed." He took out his first document. "The association claims my shed violates CC&R Section 8.4.2. He held up a copy with the text highlighted. "I'd like to begin by acknowledging this rule. It prohibits structures over 4 feet high within a 10-foot view corridor easement. The association is correct that my shed is within 10 feet of the common area boundary." 240. However, he continued, swapping the first document for the second. The rule itself is very specific about where this easement applies. He held up a large, color-coded copy of the official county plat map. He had used a bright yellow highlighter to trace the Oak Haven Drainage Creek and a red one to shade the lots to the east, as you can see from the filed plat map. The View Corridor Easement, or VCE, is legally defined and recorded, and it applies only to the 5 lots east of the creek. My property, Lot 78, is here. On the west side, my lot is not, and has never been, encumbered by this easement. A murmur rippled through the audience. A few homeowners leaned forward, squinting at the map. The board members shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Only Karen remained perfectly still. 155. The board, in its communication, has cited Board Resolution 2022-04 as a clarification that extends this rule to all properties. However, a board resolution cannot unilaterally create an easement on private property where none legally exists. That would constitute a taking of private property rights. He let that legal phrase hang in the air for a moment. More importantly, this clarification was not applied consistently or fairly. He pulled out his final document. It was the unredacted minutes Eleanor had given him. He held it up. These are the unredacted minutes from the March 2022 executive session, where the landscaping contract was renewed. They show that the board voted to proactively identify and pursue enforcement of covenant violations, specifically to generate new revenue opportunities for its primary contractor, Greenscape Solutions. The room fell into a stunned silence. The management company representative froze, his pen hovering over his notepad. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The other three board members stared at Karen, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning anger. 045. Michael had them. He could feel it. This was the moment. He had the emails from Sarah's research proving the family connection between Karen and the contractor. He could read them aloud, expose the kickback scheme, and utterly ruin her. His eyes scanned the room and landed on a teenage boy sitting in the back row. He recognized him as Karen's son, a quiet kid from the high school where Sarah taught. The boy was staring at his mother, his face pale, his eyes wide with a look of profound shame and disillusionment. In that instant, Eleanor's words echoed in Michael's mind. You can burn the whole forest down to get one tree. He made his choice. He lowered the unredacted minutes, placing them back in his portfolio. He looked at the board, his gaze steady and direct. My moral dilemma is not whether to reveal corruption, but how to restore integrity without causing unnecessary harm to a family. I have evidence of personal financial gain, but I am choosing not to present it tonight. The procedural misconduct alone is enough. He took a breath. So I will end with a simple question for the board. 010. Was this reinterpretation of Section 8.4.2 driven by a desire to create contractor revenue, applied consistently and fairly to all 47 homes bordering the common area, or was it applied only to mine? The clock buzzed softly. His time was up. The room was deathly quiet. Every eye was on Karen. Her professional mask had finally cracked. A faint flush crept up her neck, and her hands were clenched into tight fists on the table. She had no answer. The selective enforcement, the hidden motive, the improper procedure, it was all laid bare, not by a messy accusation of fraud, but by the clean, undeniable weight of the association's own documents. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, thick and heavy. It was broken, not by the board, but by David Chen, the retired engineer, who stood up from his seat in the audience. I'd like to make a motion, he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. I move that the board immediately and retroactively dismiss the violation notice and all associated fines for Lot 78. Second came a chorus of voices from the crowd. Karen, flustered, looked to the management rep for procedural guidance, but he was staring at his laptop, pointedly avoiding her gaze. One of the other board members, George, from the ACC meeting, cleared his throat, all in favor of dismissing the violation. Eleanor's hand shot up, followed by George's and the other two board members. It was 4-0. Karen did not vote. The motion passes, George announced, his voice strained. "The violation is dismissed." But David Chen wasn't finished. He remained standing. "I'd like to make a second motion. I move for a vote of no confidence in the board president, Karen Wells, for breach of fiduciary duty and undisclosed conflicts of interest." Panic flashed in Karen's eyes. "That's not on the agenda. You can't." "It is a matter of urgent community concern," David retorted, his authority as a longtime resident unwavering. "I call the question." Before a vote could even be taken, the representative from Sterling Management Solutions stood up, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Given the serious allegations raised tonight regarding vendor contracts and executive session minutes," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "Sterling Management must recommend, and in fact will now require, a full, independent, third-party forensic audit of all association contracts and financial records for the past 5 years. All current vendor payments will be suspended pending the outcome of that audit." It was over. Karen's authority had not just been challenged. It had been completely dismantled. The very procedures and rules she had weaponized had been used to corner and defeat her. She sat frozen for a moment, then gathered her papers with a jerky, clumsy motion, stood, and walked out of the room without a word, her son trailing miserably behind her. The vote of no confidence was no longer necessary. She had been rendered powerless. 3 months later, the Oakhaven Estates HOA was a different place. Karen Wells and her entire family had moved out of the neighborhood within a week of the hearing. An interim board was appointed, and, in a special election, a new one was voted in. David Chen was the new president. Eleanor Vance remained as a respected elder stateswoman. And, to his own surprise, Michael Thompson had been persuaded to run for, and was elected, board treasurer. His first official act was to draft a transparency amendment to the bylaws. It required all board meeting minutes, including executive sessions, to be published in full on the community website within 48 hours. It mandated that all vendor contracts be put out for competitive bid and that the winning bids be made public. The amendment passed with overwhelming support. The final surprise came with the results of the forensic audit. Michael sat in the clubhouse, the same room where he had faced his hearing. As the auditor presented his findings to the community, the corruption was deeper than just Karen and her brother-in-law. The audit revealed that Sterling Management Solutions, the management company, had been complicit. They had received a percentage-based administrative fee from Greenscape for every remediation job, creating a direct financial incentive for them to support and conceal the board's scheme to manufacture violations. They were the ones who had recommended the legal counsel that rubber-stamped Karen's resolutions. The community voted unanimously to terminate their contract with Sterling. They hired a small, local management firm with a reputation for integrity. The immediate savings, from renegotiating the landscaping contract alone, were staggering thousands of dollars a month. At the next board meeting, Michael, in his new role as treasurer, made a proposal. With the savings from the new management and vendor contracts, he announced, "We have a significant budget surplus this year. I move that we allocate the first month's savings to fund the installation of a new playground in the common area behind Chestnut Lane." The motion passed with a round of applause. A few weeks later, Michael stood in his backyard, watching as a crew installed swings and a slide on the very patch of common ground Karen had claimed he was obstructing. His shed, his office, stood proudly behind him, a symbol not of a fight he had won, but of a community he had helped to heal. He was at his desk inside it, writing a proposal for a new client, when he heard the first sounds of children's laughter drifting from the new playground, a sound of pure, unobstructed joy. The end.